A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
Yehudi Geber Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode, which I'll get to in a second. First of all, I have to explain my absence, so thank God I was away on trips for 3 weeks straight, and then it took me a couple of weeks to recover. So that's the absence, and of course I'm not organized enough to have a bunch of pre-recorded episodes set up, which hopefully I'll do in the future one day. But I just wanted to explain myself. So that's a good thing. If you're one of the few shuls, families, groups out there who haven't yet done a trip to Europe, then be in touch with me, yehuda@yehudigeber.com, to arrange your trip. It's some great trips. In fact, one of them, with a wonderful shul from Cedarhurst, a great group of guys, we did Jewish history in France, a little bit in Germany also, but that's more common. This is not as common as I would like to be. Maybe I'll even do an episode, a tour bite episode, about some of the highlights we saw there. Very interesting Jewish history in France. Balei Tosfos, Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, and Metz, of course. I did an entire episode about Strasbourg, and even in Paris itself. Besides for good food, there was some great Jewish history as well. So either way, but that and all other Jewish history trips around Europe and beyond, we can work out. So there's a lot of great content coming up for the podcast now that I'm back, and even on future trips this summer, I will try to pre-record and have them ready so that we don't have to miss any weeks anymore. Hopefully I'll do a few generic episodes in the next couple of weeks, and then hopefully we'll have a nice summer series on some good Jewish history topic. Another point that I want to mention before we get into today's episode is that it's right Erev Shavuos. This is coming out. So I just saw yesterday, I think. Yeah. An excellent article by Dan Rabinowitz on the Sfarim blog about the history of how the shape of the luchos are depicted in art, in Jewish art, in Sfarim, in shuls, in Aron Kodesh, in paintings in shuls, fascinating throughout history in different countries and cultures. Absolutely fascinating. I thought it was such an interesting article, and Dan Rabinowitz, whose scholarship is undisputed, laid it out really excellent, and really an enjoyable read. And I also love the whole idea of art history as it portrays Jewish history, because that's almost like a bottom-up history, more social, more of the people themselves. How are they depicting their own story and their own history throughout the ages? So I love that approach in general. So if you want to read a little pre-Shavuos read, then I recommend that article. So now getting to today's episode, we have the story of Rav Rafael Cohen, Hamburger, or of Hamburg. Rav Rafael Cohen, or HaKohen, and he was the rabbi of Hamburg for the last few decades of his life. And I was really struck by his story and how it relates to our recent secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era series. And I see him as one of the pioneers or leaders of early Orthodoxy, confronting secularization in its very early stages. And he's not as famous as some of the Orthodox leaders of the 19th century, such as the Chassam Sofer and others. So I thought I'd mention him, and I think his story and his interactions and confrontations with the new trends of secularization is quite informative and giving a broader scope of what's going on in Jewish history at the time in Central and Western Europe. So who is this Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg? He was born in 1722 and passed away in Hamburg in 1803. So he lives and has a long rabbinical and successful rabbinical career, basically covering most of the 18th century. He came from an illustrious rabbinical family. He was a relative, a close relative, I think a nephew or something, and student of Rabbi Aryeh Leib, later known as the Shagas Aryeh. This is when Rabbi Aryeh Leib, the Shagas Aryeh, had a yeshiva in Minsk. And later on, Rav Rafael Cohen was himself a Rosh Yeshiva in Minsk. He served in the rabbinate of Minsk and of many impressive communities in Poland and Russia in the mid-18th century, including Wilkomir, like I said, Minsk itself, Pinsk also, Poznan, and which is Prussian Poland, or still maybe not even, whatever, before, just as the partitions of Poland are happening. So it's Poland, basically. And then in 1776, he's appointed in Western Europe. He moves from east to west, this Polish Rav. With decades in his career in the rabbinate in Poland, his native land, he moves to Germany. And he's appointed to the prestigious position of rabbi of the three united communities known in the Jewish world as Ahu, as an acronym of Alton, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. Wandsbek. So today, Alton and Wandsbek are neighborhoods or suburbs or whatever. They're part of the larger, massive city of Hamburg. So Hamburg is definitely the dominant of the three. But and then it was considered three separate communities. And the rabbi was the chief rabbi of all three. And this was one of the most important and prestigious rabbinical positions in the entire world. So he really, like we would say in today's language, he made it. This was a very, very prestigious rabbinical position. And he served in that official capacity. And I mean official capacity as in this is an officially government-recognized, legally recognized position by the either German or Danish government. We'll see that soon. It's an officially recognized chief rabbinical position. So he serves in that official capacity for 23 years. He retires in 1799, remains in Hamburg, and he remains kind of like a rabbi emeritus until his passing a couple of years later, 4 years later, in 1803. He authored a bunch of important Sfarim, including his most famous one, Teiras Yikusiel, named for his father, which we'll discuss later on in this episode. It's part of his story as well. By the way, on our very rare trips to Hamburg, we've gone to his kever in the Altona Cemetery in Hamburg, and there's tons of potential. The Hamburg Cemetery, which he's one of the many tzaddikim buried there, is one of the most historic and impressive. The list of kivrei tzaddikim in this cemetery is incredible. And Hamburg in general has tons of Jewish history in the Hamburg area. There's so much history in Ashkenaz in general, in Germany in general, in Hamburg area specifically. There's a lot of potential, and we should be doing more trips there, which include those areas. We already mentioned France and now parts of Germany, and there's Jewish history everywhere, and we got to do some more trips. In any event, Rav Rafael Cohen became most renowned for his leadership in challenging times. The early stages of secularization, which would become much more famously associated with the 19th and early 20th centuries, but really it starts in the 18th century when he is the rabbi of Hamburg. There's the early formation of Orthodoxy in the modern era, and his response formulates the official establishment rabbinical position of Orthodoxy, and he's essentially a pioneer of Orthodoxy in the modern era. He's combating various new challenges, and that's the element of his legacy which I'd like to examine in this podcast, almost as a continuation of our series on the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era, which I recently did and generated a huge amount of feedback, which I'm still getting. So this would be a nice addition to that story. So this is not an official bio, so if you think I skipped out on parts of his life and legacy, you're probably right. I am skipping out, and it's conscious. I'm doing that purposely because I want to focus on one specific element of his life and legacy, and that is his facing his leadership in these early secularization era and the Orthodox response. So he's an early pioneer of what would emerge as a new movement called Orthodoxy. And Orthodoxy is a new movement because it's a response to modernity and its challenges. And he's one of the earliest ones who articulate it very clearly. And he lays the groundwork, so to speak, of later on those who would follow in his wake. Now, I personally used for most of the preparation for this episode the works and research and writings, the excellent research, excellent writings of Professor Shmuel Feiner, who has written extensively on this subject and specifically on Rav Rafael Cohen. But many other researchers have written too. He's not the only one. I just happen to have used him, but it's not coming to exclude others. Many, many others have written on this story as well. Okay, so one of his more famous confrontations of Rav Rafael Cohen is with the person most famously associated with the new Jew of the modern era, and that is, of course, Moses Mendelssohn. Now, I want to not elaborate on that story also. I will elaborate that on another time. It's a great story, Rav Rafael Cohen versus Moses Mendelssohn, a really important story as well, and he was opposed to Moses Mendelssohn's writings and his biur on the Torah and other things, and he tried to prevent it from getting published even. Rav Rafael Cohen tried to prevent Moses Mendelssohn's works from getting published, which he was unsuccessful at doing, and he tried to rally the rabbinical establishment against the writings of Moses Mendelssohn. So it's a great story, and it's directly related to this episode, but I prefer to focus on other ones. Perhaps we'll do some stuff on Moses Mendelssohn in the future, and we can then circle back to his dispute with Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg. I want to focus on the decade of the 1780s and the subsequent decade of the 1790s. So we're looking at the last 2 decades of the 19th century. We're focusing on the area of Ahu, of Alton and Wandsbek. In other words, this area of northern Germany, where Rav Rafael Cohen was the rabbi and his influence was most prominent. And this famed community of Ahu, of Hamburg, had been grappling with issues of secularization for several decades by the time the 1780s rolls around. So again, that's also, what do you mean? How can it, by the 1780s, and it's already dealing with secularization for several decades? That means that secularization predated Haskalah, German Haskalah, the German short-lived and unsuccessful Haskalah, which only lasted about 15, 20 years in Germany, only started in the 1770s, 1780s, and by the 1790s was gone. So secularization in Hamburg and other places started way before that, and definitely started before Reform. Reform was born in Hamburg. Reform Judaism started in Hamburg in the second decade of the 1800s. 1819 was the opening of the famous temple, the first Reformed temple in Hamburg. So secularization predated Reform by many decades in Hamburg. So again, goes back to our series on secularization, that the main thesis of that series, just in case you missed it, was that secularization takes place because of external factors, because of the modern era, because of changes in political systems, in the modernization of the world, changes in politics, changes in technology, changes in migration patterns and immigration and urbanization, industrialization, all kinds of other things, and not because of anything internal in the Jewish world, such as Haskalah or Reform. That's not what caused secularization. And this is one of the, we can add this to the endless list of proofs that I brought in the 4-part series, which you can refer to. This is another one, that secularization was something that Hamburg was grappling with since the early decades of the 18th century, 1730s, 1740s, many, many, many years before there was any Haskalah or Reform. But now in the 1780s, it had spread to such an extent, this trend of secularization, in other words, Jews in Hamburg ceasing to observe religious precepts such as Shabbos and Kashrus and other things like that. That's how we're defining secularization. So it had spread to such an extent that it was considered almost an existential threat to the religious life of the community, even though religious Jews in Hamburg in the 1780s were still in the majority. But this growing minority, especially among the youth, was seen as a very disturbing trend. It was a growing trend, and it was sweeping through the youth. And this was a big problem. This was a problem confronting the community. And the new secularists had grown to constitute a significant minority of the community. What was the claim against these secularists? Was it reform or haskalah? No, it was not that. It was just secularization. Like we said, we see from the writings of the time, the problem that the establishment religious community had with these new secularists, with this growing minority, was Chilul Shabbos, was eating treif, was a laxity in observance of other Jewish law, other areas of halacha. And of course, which is completely connected to that, it's part and parcel of the same trend, integrating in general to the surrounding non-Jewish society, because this all comes from that these external causes of the changing world around them. So they're integrating to the surrounding non-Jewish society, and therefore they're much more lax in their halachic observance. That's secularization. That's the community religious elite took this threat quite seriously. So I want to focus for a few minutes on a specific affair that took place in the Hamburg community, and that was the Nisanel, or Marcus, his Hebrew name was Nisanel, his German name was Marcus Posner affair, and that took place in 1781. Who was this Nisanel Posner? Marcus Posner, who was he? What did he do? What was the nature of his confrontation with Rav Rafael Cohen? He was a very prominent member of the community. He was quite wealthy. He was from the upper class, prominent family, wealthy, prominent businessman. In other words, he's not from the, you can't blame this on the riffraff of the community, or, some young kid or new immigrant to Hamburg, or recent arrival. No, it's not like that. It's a very, very established and central member of the community. And he was, he was lax in his religious observance. He's trying to remove himself from the community authorities in his religious observance and his personal choices in his religious life. And he looked integrated, the way he dressed. He wore, he was clean shaven, and he wore, in those days in the 1780s, this from the founding fathers of the United States at the time, it was upper class, stylish for men to wear a wig, a powdered wig. So he wore one of those, which was another sign of integration, and he did not want to be under the authority of the religious community, of the Bezdin, of the rabbi, of the religious authorities, of the Kahal of Hamburg. He wanted to just lead life the way he wanted to. Some religious laws he wanted to keep, and other ones he didn't want to, and he was not interested in being under the authority of the religious community. Okay, so without getting into all the details of what he did keep and didn't keep, that's irrelevant. He was viewed by himself and by the community as someone who was somewhere on the spectrum of secularization. Okay, that's what's important to know. Now, because he was such a prominent member of the community, because this became a real public story, the confrontations between him and the Bezdin, the confrontations between him and the rabbi, so it becomes a topic of the day, and it spills over to the media and to the general media, the German media, and it becomes to the realm of public opinion. It becomes a huge public debate. What is the extent of religious authority? What is the extent of the autonomy of the religious community that it can force members of the community to observe the halacha and the religion that they have? This becomes a huge story, topic of the day, as a classic manifestation of the clash between the established religious authority and an individual choice of secularization and his freedom from the authority of the Jewish community. Okay, so that's during this, it's the modern era. It's emancipation. the anticipated emancipation. Emancipation hasn't happened yet. 1781, it's even before the French Revolution, let alone German emancipation. But it's the anticipation of that this is a new era, this is an era of the Enlightenment, of soon everyone's going to be emancipated. So Altona, this part of the community, was under the rule of the Danish crown at this time. So it was subject to Danish law and the Danish government, Denmark, and not Germany. So Rav Rafael Cohen, who is the rabbi of the community, he dispatches a message to the government, to the Danish government, regarding this story, defending his decision in the matter, and claiming his decision, meaning to discipline this Posner fellow, and eventually to put him in cherem, to excommunicate him from the community because he did not subject himself to the legal authority of the kahal, of the rabbi. So it became a legal issue because did the rabbi have the authority to go ahead and do so? So this became a legal issue. It went to the courts. It went to the government. And Rav Rafael Cohen defended his decision in the matter, and he claimed that they were what he did in this matter, putting this guy in cherem and subjecting him to the discipline of the Beis Din and of the Jewish community, was legal, it was justified, and it was anchored in his legal autonomous authority granted to him by the Danish government in his official position as chief rabbi. In the that internal Jewish affairs are the internal affairs of the Jewish community exclusively. Now, this letter survived. We have this letter, and it's a crucial document which somewhat encapsulates much of the broader changes in Jewish history at this time. So I'd like to elaborate on its contents and what it means. So I have, obviously a Hebrew copy of the letter, and it's copied either from German or from Danish. I don't even know. So I'm doing, as we speak, a free translation from Hebrew into English. So I hope I do a half-decent job. He writes in there that as a extension of my religious position as rabbi of the community, I see it as one of the main expressions of my official capacity as chief rabbi to teach the community under my jurisdiction how to serve God and how to love Him, and to combat the new free-thinking and free-thinkers and lack of religiosity that to my great disappointment and concern is spreading among our people today, just like it's spreading among other religious communities. These new views endanger all religions. They endanger morality and ethics itself, and it endangers this civil society as a whole. It also has a terrible influence. It means the free thinkers and the lack of religiosity. In other words, secularization. It also has a terrible detrimental influence on the youth, who fall under the spell of the free thinkers and the free thinking trends, and it seduces them to all kinds of transgressions and sins. The only way to stop this stopping this trend is to use religious legal authority to prevent them from going down this road of heresy that they believe is, true and beautiful philosophy. But that's a crucial line there, because he's saying that the only way is to use religious authority to force them to submit to the authority of the kahila, of the kahal, of the rabbi, of the Jewish community. Now, that's a rough liberal translation of the letter, which is itself a translation of the original German or Danish, whatever it was. So I hope I did justice to the translation. I'm 100% sure that an English translation exists somewhere, but I don't have one. So what is he saying there? He's saying, first of all, that he's vested with rabbinical authority by the government. In other words, he's saying that if I didn't have legal jurisdiction here, legal-backed government power, then it would be literally impossible to stop this trend of secularization, because it's only because this is my capacity. This is why I'm chief rabbi, because we have an autonomous authority here that the government has granted us to take care of internal Jewish affairs, and he says it's for the benefit of the wider society. He says these secularist trends are in all religions, meaning Christians are secularizing at this time as well, which we know. And therefore, it's a danger to civil society. It's a danger to morals, because you can't have any morality without religion, according to Rav Rafael Cohen, which was a prevalent belief at the time among Christians and Jews, by the way. And he says the only way to stop this terrible trend of secularization and free thinking, especially among the youth who are susceptible to this, is by using these religious authority means. And what does he mean by that? Rav Rafael Cohen resorts to the time-tested method of the cherem, and he excommunicates this Posner guy. But times have changed, and the cherem doesn't exactly work the way he wanted it to. Why? Because this is an era of religious tolerance. This is an era of individual rights. This is the 1780s. This is an era where everyone's already talking about emancipation. The French Revolution is around the corner. The American Revolution, by the way, has already happened. So it seems anachronistic for a religious authority to wield the weapon of the cherem in a fashion against an individual religious choice. So Rav Rafael's action gets judged by the wider public opinion, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And religious coercion, which is essentially what Rav Rafael Cohen was using, and he felt he was legally justified because that's what had taken place for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. The non-Jewish governments gave authority for Jews and the religious authorities to have their own judicial and legal internal affairs regarding Jewish religion. That's how it had always been. But it was now frowned upon. And the limits of rabbinical and kahal judicial authority and autonomy were called into question. Rav Rafael Cohen was depicted in the media as this Polish rabbi. He was an immigrant. He wasn't depicted that way. He actually was. He had moved only 5 years earlier, 1776, we said. He was hired as the rabbi of Hamburg. And therefore, since he was from Poland, he was not acclimated to Western Europe. And therefore, Rav Rafael Cohen was considered, again, this is in the realm of public opinion. I'm not stating what, God forbid, us religious Jews would say about Rav Rafael Cohen, who was one of the greatest tzaddikim who ever lived, and for sure in his own generation, and was one of the greatest Torah scholars in the entire world. We're talking about how he was depicted in the media as a religious fanatic. And his old nemesis, Moses Mendelssohn, who I mentioned, he had a confrontation and dispute a couple of years earlier, he weighed in on the issue as well, regarding the limits of rabbinical power to punish and force religious issues. The claim was made that who has the power to mete out punishments? In the modern era, the government can mete out punishments through the judicial system. And the government does that in order to protect the public good. For people who are criminals, thieves, murderers, tax evasion, I don't know, whatever's considered a crime, illegally crossing a border, I don't know, whatever's considered a crime. That's when the government punishes its citizens in order to protect the public good. Do religious figures in the modern era have the power to impose punishment for religious restrictions? That was a question that was facing civil society at that time. Does an individual Jew in this day and age, meaning in the 1780s, have the individual right to desecrate Shabbos or eat pork or not observe basic Jewish law in a public fashion and still identify as a Jew without converting to Christianity? That's what the question was. Does an individual have that right? Can he be forced to observe Jewish law in the 1780s, as had been in the past? Or if he wants to not observe Shabbos, if he wants to eat pork, then he has to convert to Christianity, because if he's part of the Jewish community, and the Jewish community is a legal entity, so then he is forced to observe the laws of the Jewish community, and forced to submit to the authority of the Bezdin, the Kahal, and the rabbi. He can convert to Christianity, that's a legal and religious move, and then he's not under the jurisdiction of the Jewish community, and then he can do whatever he wants. Well, he has to do whatever the Christian authorities want, right? Now, these were the questions facing Rav Rafael Cohen. These were the questions facing the Jewish community of Hamburg and non-Jewish society and the Danish and German governments and other Western European governments at this time. Now, in the interim, at this specific juncture in history, the cherem was still considered legal and binding. In other words, that was clear that Rav Rafael Cohen had the legal power to impose the cherem. And this understandably impacted Posner's social life. So Posner was not too happy that he was put in cherem. So he decides to voluntarily submit himself to Rav Rafael Cohen and his Bezdin to repent and have the cherem, excommunication, removed from him. So Rav Rafael submits a list of religious demands for Posner to commit to as a precondition for his removal of the cherem. And Posner balked and refused. He said, no way. These are draconian measures. He's going to have to grow a beard again. He's going to have to dress in a certain way. He's going to have to, submit to a full religious observance and full religious authority. So he refused. So Rav Rafael said, okay, so the cherem's still in place. So Posner goes ahead and appeals the decision to the Danish government. And he requested that he be permitted to legally remain a member of the Jewish community because he does not wish to convert to Christianity, but he wants to be allowed to lead a secular lifestyle within the Jewish community. So this was his appeal to the Danish government. Now, at this time in the 1780s, a legal framework such as described did not exist. You could either be a member of the Jewish community and then under the jurisdiction of that community, or you could convert to Christianity. So this is at the border of the modern era, because as soon as emancipation and all that happens a few decades later, so then that does exist. But right now in the 1780s, at least in the area of Alton and Hamburg, it didn't exist. So the government denies his request. So he's not able to live in the Jewish community and have a secular lifestyle. He has to submit to the authority of the Bezdin and the rabbi. Okay. But, and this point is crucial and historic, the government did concede to Posner that the rabbi no longer had the authority to excommunicate, no longer had the authority to use the cherem without explicit government authorization for each individual case. In other words, if the rabbi wanted to wield and use the weapon of cherem, he had to submit a formal request to the government. The government would review the case and decide, can the rabbi use cherem over here or not? Now, the Danish government's decision to remove the cherem, this removed the greatest weapon that rabbinical authority possessed until the modern era, and therefore greatly blunted their legal power to impose religious law. Ultimately, it would be changes in legislation, in non-Jewish governmental legislation, such as this, which would weaken the power of the rabbinate in the modern era and greatly enable the possibility of secularization without the need to convert to Christianity. And that is one of the greatest changes of the modern era, that it's possible to become a secular Jew within the framework of the Jewish community without needing to convert to Christianity. So this Posner story really brings all this out. Now there's another bunch of confrontations which I want to go through briefly. So Rav Rafael Cohen had another confrontation 3 years later with the very famous or infamous secular Jew of the modern era, Solomon or Shlomo Maimon. And the reason he's famous is because he, first of all, he wrote his memoirs. That's one way to become famous. A very, very famous memoir, very descriptive. And in his memoir, he comes across as a very arrogant and provocative individual. And he always looked for confrontation with religious authority. He's someone who grew up in Lithuania, and very religious home, and eventually rejects religion. He even tries out the new Hasidic movement for a very, very brief encounter. And then he moves to Germany, Berlin, and other places. He does a lot of traveling. He's wandering, and he has a troubled life and a troubled individual. And he becomes this secular Jew, a German philosopher, and becomes this self-taught expert in philosophy, and so on and so forth. In any event, he describes that he had this confrontation with Rav Rafael Cohen in 1784. Solomon Maimon refused to send his wife a get back in Lithuania, where she was. He left her as an iguna. So when she found out that he was in Hamburg, she sent a letter to Rav Rafael Cohen and his Bezdin. Can you help me obtain a get from my now secular husband? So Rav Rafael Cohen demanded that he appear before his Bezdin so he can discuss this issue. Maimon refuses. He says the Bezdin and the community rabbi have no authority over me. I'm a secular Jew. They have no authority. Finally, Maimon agrees to meet personally with the rabbi in a non-judicial setting, non-Bezdin setting, as meeting the rabbi in his study for a personal visit. Rav Rafael Cohen bemoaned the fact. He said, I know you. I knew your father. He was a great man. I knew you back in Lithuania. And your father used to bring you to me when you were a small child, and I tested you. He says, you probably don't remember this, but I tested you as a small child, and you knew the Gemara so well, I envisioned that you were destined for greatness, and look at you today. Look what has become of you. You're secular. You're such a, you left your wife as an iguna. You became all secular, no longer lead a religious life, and you don't submit to rabbinical authority. Now, the ever-provocative Maimon gets into a dispute with the rabbi, and it didn't end well, to say the least. But then, again, this is showing how in 1784, there's this. He's a famous secularist, Solomon Maimon. But again, he's confronting with the Rav Rafael Cohen. Rav Rafael Cohen is aware of this growing trend, and it upsets him, and he's trying to put a stop to it. And that brings us to the next one. The next one is his dispute with a very, very colorful and another problematic individual named Shaul Levin in the late 1780s. This is all the same decade. All this happens in the 1780s. It's fascinating to watch these changes in the Jewish community, the secularization that's happening in real time. In the 1770s, Rav Rafael Cohen had published one of his most famous Torah works. He published several. He was a brilliant Torah scholar. And this one was entitled Toras Yekusiel, named so in honor of his father. This was a commentary on Yoreh Deah, an area of halacha. And as opposed to what we were talking about until now as secularists, all right, this Posner and Maimon were secularists. That's what we've been discussing until now. Shaul Levin is an example of an authentic maskil. Now we're talking about a real, bona fide maskil, not a secularist. So this Shaul Levin came from a Torah-observant, very rabbinic family, but he was a complete maskil. He tried to keep it hidden for several years, but later we say he came out of the closet, and he was one of the more infamous maskilim of his time. Shaul Levin was the son of the rabbi of Berlin, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Levin, and Shaul Levin was most famous for being the forger of the Shailas Uchuvas Besamim Reish, which is a great story, how he forged that and what he was trying to accomplish with that. And we'll have to devote a future episode into this fascinating story of the forgery of the Besamim Reish. Either way, Shaul Levin anonymously published another work entitled Mitzpeh Yekasel, which openly derided Rav Rafael Cohen's Sefer Toras Yekusiel. The entire Sefer was just to put it down, was putting down his Torah scholarship, pointing out alleged mistakes made by the author. And he claimed that the author was guilty of plagiarism, copying from others. Now, this obviously wasn't true. And he was just being provocative. He was trying to go against Rav Rafael Cohen because Rav Rafael Cohen was known as this religious fanatic fighting secularization. So he didn't like him. So he was his enemy. He was trying to damage him, damage his reputation as a Rav, as a rabbi. Now this book, this Mitzpeh Yekasel book, was put in Cherem, and the rabbinical establishment across Central Europe rallied in Rav Rafael Cohen's defense. There were even instances of book burnings of Shaul Levin's book. And soon he was exposed as its author as well. He was doxed as its author. So, what's this story teaching us? So, to me, as a historical story, the story of what one maskil did to a prominent and important rabbi is not that interesting, nor is it important. Rav Rafael Hamburger's Torah greatness and his leadership and his scholarship is unquestionable in my eyes, and I assume everyone else's eyes. And this silly maskil and his futile efforts to put him down are not even worth mentioning as a footnote of Jewish history. So why am I mentioning it? Why is it a significant story in the broader scope of Jewish history? because of the reaction of the wider Jewish community to the publication of Shaul Levin's book and the united defense of the rabbinical establishment internationally across borders to one of their prestigious peers who was under attack and needed defense. The rallying together, the defensive posture, the using international coalitions of rabbis to make statements, to publish proclamations, which many were published, kol koires, to make speeches in community shuls across Europe, to make bans and cherems against the book, in even book burnings, and then doxing the author, publicizing who the real author behind this scandalous work, all in this defensive way to defend the rabbi, to defend Rav Rafael. Not so much defending the Sefer as a halachic work, not even so much defending Rav Rafael Cohen, but more so in defense of the honor and of the rabbinate of itself. Now, all of those things that I mentioned, these are all very distinctive features of the emerging orthodoxy in the modern era. This is orthodoxy is a modern movement, and this is orthodoxy in the modern era. And all that really comes out in this story. That's why I think it's such an informative story. Another little confrontation, not direct confrontation. In 1794, now we're getting to the 1790s, there was a maskil publication for several years called Hama'asef, Königsberg, Breslau, Eastern Germany. So one of the prominent maskilim at the time in Germany was a fellow by the name of Aaron Wolfson. And he writes, again, this is Haskalah, not secularization. So we're mixing a little bit the Haskalah and secularization in this narrative, in this episode. So both Haskalah and secularization can coexist hand in hand at times. So this Aaron Wolfson, the maskil, publishes in Hama'asef a satire, play, entitled, in Hebrew obviously, this is Haskalah. Haskalah is less integration into German society and more about reviving Hebrew and Jewish identity in the modern era, so it's Hebrew. So he writes this play in Hebrew, and it's called Sicha Be'eretz HaChaim. And Sicha Be'eretz HaChaim describes a theological debate about the Jewish religion and the Jewish people between Moses Mendelssohn versus a Polish rabbi living in Germany. Who's this Polish rabbi living in Germany? It's none other than Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg, who is viewed as the epitome of a Polish rabbi in Germany, representing the ultimate religious Torah leader, the establishment traditional Torah leader, combating the challenges of modernity during this time. And in this play, the Rambam comes and mediates between the two sides. Between this debate between Moses Mendelssohn and the Polish rabbi living in Germany, who's none other than Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg. And the Rambam, shockingly for a maskil publication, sides with Mendelssohn, right? Of course. So the Rambam sides with Mendelssohn. That's the point of it. But my point of bringing it out is that Rav Rafael Cohen is held up as the fighter, as the one defending religion, as defending tradition against the secularization, against modernity. Now, there's another side topic here to explore one day, maybe we'll get to it, how the Rambam is used, and more often than not misused, by literally everyone in Jewish history in order to promote their own agenda, and that continues right down till this very day, which is another fascinating story, how the Rambam becomes this flexible, anyone can use for their own agenda thing, but that I'll save for another time. Now, Rav Rafael of Hamburg looked at the Jewish world around him in the 1780s and 1790s with a lot of anger, with a lot of pain, and with a lot of fear for the Jewish future. How do we know that? Because he expressed this quite openly and quite often during public speeches that he gave during the 1790s, which were later published as his Sfarim, which is a fascinating historical document as well. He acknowledges in those speeches that secularization was a trend for decades already before him. In other words, before the 1780s, he says secularization has already been spreading here. And he specifically is referring to secularization, not reform or Haskalah or anything else. But now in the 1790s, this trend no longer has any busha. That's how he refers to it. It's out in the open. It's no longer in secret. It's a movement towards secularization, and it's growing in adherence. He vowed to defend, he said his job is to defend the traditional rabbinical establishment at all costs, and in his view, that defense of the traditional rabbinical establishment is the recipe to protect the Jewish people and religious lifestyle, religious observance of the wider community going forward. He engaged in polemics with his opponents. He warned of the dangers of the New World and of growing secularization and integration into the non-Jewish society. He also articulated, perhaps more clearly than anyone else at the time, but which is such a distinctive feature of Orthodoxy since his time until today, and he's one of the first to articulate it so clearly, the separation between different camps in the Jewish world. It wasn't blurred by him. He already saw it very clearly, which today is one of the most distinctive features of Orthodoxy, is that there's an us and them, right? This was completely new. I mean, Rav Rafael Hamburg basically invented it. It was completely new at the time. It was to a certain extent revolutionary concept at the time, but it's one of the most defining features of Orthodoxy today since the modern era, that there's an us and them. These are the borders. These are the boundaries. And there's those that protect tradition and adhere to religious pretexts, and then there's another camp of secularization who don't protect tradition and don't adhere to religious halachic observance of law, and raising the walls in defense between the two camps. So he's certainly one of the pioneering creators of Orthodoxy, which we benefit from till today. He also pioneered another one of the most distinctive identifiers of Orthodoxy in the modern era, which is that before Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg, there were attempts to engage with those who were secularizing, or rebuke them, or attempt to return them to the traditional fold. He himself did that in his earlier years. We spoke about that in this episode. But his approach, especially in his later years, his last years, was to ignore the secularizers. And he said, no, the ones who are secularizing, we're not dealing with them. We're not rebuking them. We're not returning them to the fold. We want to focus on strengthening the fortress of those who are still inside, the Orthodox community. We want to defend. It's a defensive posture. Those who still adhere to a traditional lifestyle. Those who still adhere to Orthodoxy. We want to close ranks, defend from attack, build walls, and hunker down and ensure survival. And then ultimately, after survival, there will be a flourishing from within. So that he, in many ways, is a pioneer of Orthodoxy. And that's his this historical role in combating the New World and secularization. And it's one last important point about the historical and geographical context. We tend to think that secularization started later, 1800s, maybe even mid-1800s. No, this is from the early 1700s. It's starting perhaps even earlier, probably the 1600s. It was already existed in certain areas. And this was certainly pre-reform, pre-Haskalah. There was some Haskalah in the 1780s and 90s, but it was short-lived and it wasn't much to talk about. And here, another point to talk about is that he's a Polish rabbi in Germany. And very often it was Polish rabbis who were imported to Germany who had this vision, and he came from a much more traditional background because secularization had not yet spread to Eastern Europe, and these Polish rabbis in Germany were considered by the growing trends of secularization as fanatics, as religious Jews from Poland who are coming to impose their religious authority here in the emancipated world, the integrated world. Now, in this context, it's worth mentioning who are some of the other ones, who are some of the other pioneering rabbis of Orthodoxy. When we discuss Orthodoxy in the modern era, we're used to hearing the following four categories of Orthodox rabbis combating the challenges of modernity. Number one, the Chassam Sofer and his descendants and students in the greater area of Hungary or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Number two, Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch and other German Orthodox rabbis of the 19th century, such as the Würzburger Rav, or Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer, or Marcus Lehman, and of course earlier than them, such as the Aruch LaNer, etc. That's number two. Number three, we tend to think of as the great Hasidic leaders of Eastern Europe who combated secularism and the modern trends of the 19th century, such as the Yismach Moshe in Hungary, the Bnei Yissaschar, and Menachem Mendel of Rimanov early in Poland, later on the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz, in Russia the Tzemach Tzedek of Chabad, and many, many, many others. And the fourth category would be in Lithuania, people like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement, or the Alter of Slobodka, or many other Lithuanian Litvisher rabbis, or Rashi Yeshiva, Balei Musar of the Lithuanian Russian Torah world, Yeshiva world. Those are the four categories we generally think of. But here I want to look at it from an entirely new angle, both chronologically and geographically. I think that the trend of rabbis pioneering orthodoxy and combating the challenges of the modern era started much earlier and in a different place, in Central and Western Europe. People like the topic of this episode, Rav Rafael Cohen of Hamburg in the 18th century, and very early 19th century. So who are those? Some of them are famous for other things, but not this, and some aren't famous at all. And examples of those would include Rabbi Yosef David Zinsheim of Strasbourg and later in Paris, who became famous as the rabbi of Napoleon's quote-unquote Sanhedrin, or Rabbi Cheskel Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda of Prague. And even more so, his student, his prize student, his closest student, Rabbi Eliezer Fleckels, the Tshuva Me'ava. Or even, we could go 2 generations earlier than that, or generation rather earlier than that, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavitz, also in Hamburg, or Rabbi David Tevli of Lisa, and many, many others. So I'm thinking maybe we'll do a series on this chapter of Jewish history profiling some of these individuals as pioneers of orthodoxy, and then we can have a great topic about pioneers of orthodoxy. I think it might be a good idea of a series. Let's see, we might do that in the future. This was Yehuda Garber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudagarber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.